Okay, good afternoon, welcome. I need some housekeeping things first. So I'm Nick, I'm Professor in Informatics, Data and Visualization. And this is one of a number of Turing Network Development Award seminars that we're running this year. And part of the potential connection of Kings to Turing at some point later in the year or next year. So, two things, we're already being recorded, so it's too late to say we're going to be, but if you're leave the room or the call, I guess. There's an attendance form in person and online. There are QR codes around the room on the desks. If you scan those, it'll help you sign up to that. That's useful for us because we have protocol. You can ask questions online. Will be put through to lots of people joining from upstairs, I noticed. You'll be put through here and we'll get questions asked either during the course of the seminar or at the end, certainly. Okay, Matt, here's Matt. So you won't know this, Matt's a pop star. He used to have a pop band, and if you look on the internet, you'll find him looking very different to how he does today, playing a very impressive guitar. But he's also at Newcastle University, where he has, over the years, I'd like to say we, but mostly it was Matt, set up the data science MSc programs and worked very hard on establishing a very successful program of data science MScs and apprenticeships for companies to send to take the MScs over a couple of years part-time. He's also Turing, he must be Turing Fellow. Yes, but also works on Turing's Big Skills program with DCMS among others, and I guess you'll tell us a bit more about that soon. And working to set a national data skills landscape, not framework. Okay, I think that's enough for me. Matt, over to you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, everyone. So we've got about 2 hours in the diary here. I'm imagining that probably we'll use the first hour mainly for the kind of structure, which is sort of follow-ups after that. And I'd like to keep things as interactive as possible. I'm kind of here as much to learn, hopefully, to inform as well. So as Nick says, I'm a reader in data science at Newcastle Uni, senior advisor to the Turing Institute, and I advise DCMS as well in the skills space. What I'd like to do first of all is just ask 1 or 2 questions. So those of you joining on Teams, we have sidebar visible to us for everyone in the room. And what I'd like people to think about for a second is first of all, who do we have in the room? So it would be fantastic to see both in the chat and also in the room, do we have a mixture of PhD students? Anyone here? Feel free, if you're on the Teams chat, just to introduce yourself briefly. Researchers, postdocs, yeah. Academic colleagues, lecturers, and the like. Any industry folk with us? Excellent. Any policymakers? Anyone who feels like any of those descriptions doesn't quite apply? Yes.
I work with Kings and Library Services. Brilliant. We're dealing with business intelligence and data, and it's a field where we feel we need to implement more. So I'm kind of curious.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much thanks for joining us.
There's a message coming through.
We'll allow Paul to type. And what I'd love to hear from everyone as well. That's great. Thanks very much, Paul. Very interesting. Is what does data skills mean to each of you? Really broad field, many definitions. I'd be interested just if 1 or 2 people in the room might like to talk about kind of their level of interest, whether it's sort of core data science, whether it's the data literacy piece that they're most involved in. Would anyone like to share any views on their primary interests? This will allow us to sort of tailor a little bit the remainder of the session towards those areas. Thanks very much, Tora, for joining. Well, those formidable characters managing PhD and work. Yeah, what do people think of when we talk about data skills? What comes to mind? I'll turn to you, Nick, first.
a gap mostly between what people want to do with data and what they can do with data. So even if they have used Excel spreadsheets, moving on to something that does analytics like Mathematica, my favorite tool at the moment, or other tools are available, it seems a big challenge for a lot of people. And at King's, there's a program of data skills to try and upskill many people across many faculties. So it's a nascent program, isn't it, Mike? The King's Data Skills program is not yet live across the whole college.
You mean what we're doing?
Yeah.
We don't yet have anything that we're doing. So
It's something in discussion. Yeah. So yeah.
That's really great. Thanks, Nick. And yeah, Caitlin, absolutely a lot of wrangling, that common trope of the data wrangling piece being about 80% of the data scientist's time. Some of the studies say, oh, maybe it's closer to 65%. Some say, no, actually, it's more like 90, but absolutely. Something about making informed decisions. And Getty, on your point around understanding data in context, I think is a really key piece. And I always feel a little bit embarrassed when I show this slide because it feels really worn out and overused, these kind of typical data science Venn diagrams. This one dates back, as far as 2014, but I think it can be useful in a few ways. Probably everyone in the room today and everyone on the Teams call can probably identify themselves somewhere in this figure. If you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been at probably like the furthest extreme of computer science because I failed AS level maths spectacularly, had a horrible time with it, went through a computing science degree. So that's where I would identify. And I think everyone can position themselves somewhere within this. So we've got the dual concerns of the computing science and the statistical expertise, but then also to Gefion's point around understanding data in context, we have subject matter expertise on this version of the diagram. Commercial acumen is sometimes the other label. And if we think about our own development journeys in terms of our use of data, well, what we're probably doing is we're coming from a starting point and we're wanting to move somewhere towards the middle. The fact that center says unicorn says, well, actually, these people rarely or maybe even don't exist. So what's actually more important is being able to work across the interface. So when we're looking at data science teams, we have more than one individual representing different areas of this space. And it's around being able to communicate across those boundaries effectively that we're really aiming for. Yes.
The camera just told us it stopped sending your image.
Yeah, it did.
Very strange. To switch the camera
to another camera. I'll try cycling it, see if that helps. I'm joining from 37,000 feet. There we go. Right. Budley IQ. Maybe not. What do we think, Nick?
Yeah, we'll try one of them.
Wolf vision sounds pretty exciting, doesn't it? So we'll give that one a try first. Video stopped working, try unplugging camera and plugging back in. So my understanding from the AV guy might be if I unplug USB-C and replug it, that we might have some level of luck.
Go for it. In doubt, reboot. See him? Go back to the camera and Hadley.
There we go. Hopefully we've got you back. Feel free to, okay. There we go. We get a bit of confirmation in chat that you've got the room back again, hopefully. Okay.
I can see that now on the screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry for the folk on Teams and indeed folk in the room. So we talked a little bit around being able to identify ourselves in this plot, but I think also when we talk about educational offers, we can often think about this in quite a useful way. So Nick mentioned some of the programs that we've developed out as Newcastle, and very deliberately they were joint partnerships between School of Computing, School of Maths and Staff, and National.
Excellent.
Okay, does that call seem to be on? The presentation stopped.
I think it's time.
There we go. Let's see how that goes. Yeah, so we can also think about educational programs in this sort of way as well, you know, collaborations across departments. And to the subject matter expertise piece, I was going to highlight the National Innovation Centre for Data, which is a national asset that's based out of Newcastle. And it's really that joint collaboration that brings strength to the way we do things. You could, you know, despite my AS level failure, you could just about strong arm me to teach an introductory statistics course. But what I wouldn't be able to do is signpost what's happening in research. It's going to have a downstream impact in industry, you know, in content. So we've got a highly multidisciplinary field. And I think one thing I always like to highlight at this point is that leads to a significant opportunity for imposter syndrome. So whenever I run induction sessions in my Newcastle program, we've got folk returning from industry wanting to upskill, to Gefion's point, adding, you know, that context around that data. Got people who've come straight through undergraduate programs who are daunted by their professional expertise. And I think people are always tend to focus on the gaps in their knowledge rather than strength, and lose sight that actually we need, as a collective, to have coverage of this sort of skill set. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges around widening participation in data science, and I think this, you know, some of the effects of this multidisciplinary context will become a little clearer there. When we look at the skills landscape, what we have is complexity. And I think the thing that's important to realise is that no individual organisation or no individual sector is going to be able to address all of the challenges that we face in terms of data skills. Some of the main challenges that we'll cover off today are some of these. So first of all, this sort of uncertainty around terminology and naming. You look out at industry and you see people called data scientists, called data engineers, called data analysts, but actually their functional roles and their responsibilities can differ quite significantly. This leads to, I suppose, challenges for organizations recruiting the talent that they actually need in terms of their current level of data maturity and being able to advance that. One of the most common examples you see is the early stage startup that stretches itself to hire a full fat data scientist. And then this data scientist starts their role. They find it not a very enriching experience because the data quality within the organisation isn't anywhere near ready for them to really flex their skill set. So there's challenges for organisations knowing the skill sets that they need. There's a significant negative impact that this can have for individuals entering the job market as well, because we end up with these job descriptions, with these job ads going out with essential criteria that no individual could hold, essential criteria that span that full Venn diagram we saw. It's this time of year at Newcastle with my master's students where people are off applying into roles. And I'd say this year, I'm probably eligible for about 10% of the entry-level data science roles that my students are looking at because of some of this unrealistic expectation setting. And why that bothers me so much is that we want and we need diversity in the field. And exactly the sort of people that will be detracted by seeing something as an essential criteria that they don't entirely hit are the types of people that we want to build out in terms of the data teams that we have. So there's a really sort of significant equity implication of these job descriptions going out with miscalibrated requirements. I suppose ironically we have a bit of, sorry. So I suppose it might be really strong technical implementation skills on the big data side, the data engineering piece, combined with a foundational understanding of Bayesian stats that you would only have got through a stats degree.
There's a tiny number of people who have that ability. Actually, they don't need that typically.
So I think probably very often you would have a conversation with an employer and say, well, actually, which is it? What do you actually need? And they may be able to give you some clarity on that. But really, you're looking at it, and sometimes it's a skill set. Well, if you haven't done 2 masters or haven't been very fortunate to upskill and do professional development in a very broad way, you're unlikely to have that level of specialism. And there are jokes you see on LinkedIn from people who've developed Python packages where it says, 5 years experience of this. And well, I wrote that package and released it for the first time 3.5 years ago. So like no one in the world, not even the author, would be eligible. And the trick I have is actually helping learners who maybe naturally aren't all that empowered, might, in the same way that people are developing code and something goes wrong, they'll blame themselves rather than a development experience issue with the tooling. They'll say, oh, well, I'm not good enough for the role, so I won't try. It's helping people sniff out, well, actually, that's an organization that you probably want to dodge because they don't know what they need. And there's a bit of what we'll talk about later is a bit of the awareness raising piece that we're doing with organizations because they struggle. Before the pandemic, we looked at the executive education training available in data science and AI. And if you were in London and had £3,000 a day per person, well, okay, you're relatively well served. But if you're anywhere else in the country, I think there was a gap you got as far as Cranfield, that's about as far north as you could get before Edinburgh, and then there was an absolute dearth. So what we've done is a lot of work around free at the point of access executive training to help those organisations know what to ask for. We have this data deficit though, in terms of us being able to monitor the labour market, see where those gaps are, see where that inequality lies in terms of the demographics of the people that are represented or not. Until quite recently, and still an ongoing issue, it's been very difficult to get the right level of visibility on some of this. We'll cover some examples. We'll cover off this sort of misalignment between industry need and training that's available. And also we'll talk about some of these challenges of raising awareness and democratizing access to this, to training that is fit for purpose. I suppose my first foray into the sort of the labour market analysis piece started a couple of years ago with a Royal Society report, Dynamics of Data Science Skills, where we set out to try and measure the increase in terms of demand for data adjacent roles. And, we saw between 2013, which was the earliest data point that we had available, and 2017 and 18, where the data was collected, really significant rises across the board and in certain areas in particular. But I suppose one of the limitations that we had here was we were using not particularly granular data, granular PISA data, which was talking about graduates coming from degree programs. And at that point, there weren't as many data and AI programs as there are now. So we're having to be quite permissive in looking at other types of feeder programs coming in. We're looking at all graduates from computer science, stats, operational research, physics, those sorts of roles. So it wasn't, it didn't have the level of clarity that we wanted. And also in terms of the demand piece, we were using data from LinkedIn. Now, that was quite valuable data for what it was, but what that didn't capture was individuals upskilling within individual organizations, people being poached and headhunted. It didn't capture roles within government that typically didn't hit the sorts of platforms that were being measured. So in response to that, a year or two ago, we had two projects, one with Ipsos Mori that was looking at the kind of really high-end AI talent piece, and then one that I was most involved with, for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which was looking at, actually, we need to triangulate on this. We need to understand what are the skill sets that industry need or think they need. What are learners, adult learners' perceptions around, I suppose, the value of data skills for their ongoing study and their ongoing careers, and to be able to have that sort of view in terms of the particular impact regionally and by sector. So we did a bit of work with DCMS and with Opinium, who helped us out with the survey instrument. We reached out to 1,000 organisations, 5,000 employees across the UK, and a little over 1,000 adult learners. And we set out with this mission to try and measure the supply-demand gap in the UK in terms of data skills. And the top level figure that we arrived at was, as an instantaneous demand, it was about 238,000 data adjacent roles that we were missing. We heard from organisations that were struggling to recruit for the skill set that we needed. We saw, North East of England particularly struggling in terms of that demand, that increased demand and capacity not quite matching it. And we made a couple of other observations that I suppose were most concerning. We spoke to graduates and asked them around their confidence levels with some of the data competencies that you might look for in terms of translating data science solutions into practical application. And we had this situation where adult learners, people coming through degree programs, rated their level of competence higher than the industries that were hiring them. So we saw this kind of mismatch that kind of suggests that a deeper relationship and a deeper collaboration to make sure that the degree programs that we offer, the apprenticeships we offer, the other forms of training that we make available, make sure that that really hits that sort of day one competency that industry needs to. When we look at the way that data science is taught currently, there's a statistic that stuck with me most of all, probably. There are a couple in the presentation today, but this is one of the most stark ones. Anaconda, who are an organisation in the scientific Python community, some of you might be familiar with them, they ran a survey with graduates from data science programs and asked them about a variety of aspects of the course and what they felt that had been delivered. And they found that 85% of people who'd come through a data science program self-declared that they'd received 0 ethics training. Not just with, oh yeah, they mentioned ethics and it wasn't very good or it didn't feel very applicable to me, but they felt actually the word ethics almost had not been a part of the program. This is a real, really sort of significant concern in terms of, this is really foundational above any kind of technical skill set, to make sure that we're getting those professional values instilled through the programs we teach. Later on, we'll talk about some of the interventions at the educator level that we're doing to try and solve this But I suppose what we need to recognize here is that many of the people who teach out on data science programs, they've maybe, a bit like me, come through a narrow computer science training myself. So if you task me with teaching an ethics curriculum, the barriers of confidence there, and I wouldn't necessarily know where to turn to start. So by highlighting this as an issue, I'm not attributing blame to the programs that are out there, more just recognizing that there's a challenge and that more needs to be done.
So in your diagram before, when you were overlapping, can we interrupt or people are? So in your diagram that you had the different disciplines, right? It was totally missing the ethical part.
It is.
You had computer science and math, which are basically roughly the same if you consider the orthogonality of ethics. Why was that?
Yeah, so I think crucially, the ethics that is taught in computing degrees, the ethics that is taught in maths degrees isn't fit for purpose for what we're talking about here. Something we'll talk about shortly when I look at some of the work around professionalisation, standard setting, accreditation of data professionals, is that we have this really strong piece that you're right isn't represented in that Venn diagram. It's like this sort of cross-cutting professional values piece.
Well, instead of math, you could have philosophy, and you would sort of. So it seems like every time we talk about ethical behavior is an afterthought. It's something for people who do that, which actually in reality is not there at all, right? For example, if you consider the problem of fairness, there are plenty of computer scientists actually studying how you could build algorithms that would sort of alleviate fairness, which is very technical as well. So it's not something that ethics is not something that is dealt only by philosophers.
Absolutely.
So the fact that, for example, you're saying that you come from computer science, still, there are computer scientists doing fairness, right? So
Absolutely.
why considering ethics as a sort of separate kind of afterthought in the curriculum?
So I personally don't. I think it's core. And I think one of the challenges that we see, of the 15% who had been taught ethics, some of it might have been a guest lecture from a philosopher where maybe it didn't embed. It might be in optional modules. It might be that sort of thing. It might be, stuff that's delivered in semester 2 as part of dissertation modules when actually learners probably have the potential to do a ton of damage by that point. What we need is for that to be embedded. So when someone's doing a machine learning assignment, almost to build in those kind of ethical gotchas as part of the technical work. So to say, okay, right, you're building a model, you've got postcode as a feature, actually, and then the great reveal, do you realize what you've actually done despite good model performance is something unintended? So I think it's more around what I advocate for is that deeper embedding within the technical curriculum so people don't see that mismatch. I think we see this, it's often framed as responsible research and innovation, which isn't taught nearly as well as it should be. But it feels like there's a
seminar is on the Turing way.
Very good. So we'll tease a tiny bit of that today, but we've hopefully got a solution. I think people sometimes see ethics as a limiting factor, where actually when you talk to a lot of organizations, actually the uncertainty is inhibiting them. So actually having that sort of clarity can actually be a bit of an enabler. So I think, yeah, I absolutely don't see it as an afterthought. It needs to be, built in from the start, that sort of proactive engagement with stakeholders and the groups who are going to be impacted by it.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make as well was that as computer scientists, it's not an excuse because one is computer scientist to not think about what is called responsible AI. And I think in academia is lagging behind what industry now is going for responsible. I mean, Google even had time in the last 3 years to fire the ethical team. And it's a bit surprising that in academia, you don't have that kind of technical abilities to address the core issue in responsible AI. So it's, it's not disjoint, it's not orthogonal. is very technical and it's not best left to only philosophers. That's, I guess, the
I completely agree. And on where we're looking, slide 33. We'll get there in 3.5 hours. We'll talk about some stuff we're doing at Turing to try and reduce some of these tensions, to make training material available that'll, I suppose, support that quality enhancement in terms of the way we teach. And absolutely that principle of it's not an afterthought, but it's embedded right throughout. But it's a really good. So I think to that point, there's a bit of unpicking to do when we teach, because I get a lot of learners coming through who have this sort of intrinsic excitement around the technology, and they just want to dive in, build models, get things to run at scale and do that piece. And there has to be that sort of tempering effect to get people to think about the consequences, think about the sorts of application areas that people are working into. And pretty much the point I was going to make on this slide was this need for that close embedding, for that learning across those disciplines, and trying to have, I suppose, communities of practice that allow that to happen. And that isn't just within academia, but that's also speaking out into industry practice, where there's a lot that we can learn. So widening participation has been something that I'm very passionate about, and in terms of Newcastle practice, we've done quite a lot of work there. And I mentioned before this desire to have data science teams and their composition being as representative of the general population that's going to be affected by data-driven solutions. But let's have a little bit of a look at what this means in practice. So there's this statistic from ONS from 2019, which I believe will still approximately hold, and they were looking at the risk of automation, of which data science and AI was a major part. And they saw, 70% of the roles that were at risk of disappearing or changing dramatically were held by women. So there's a really sort of significant need to, at the policy level and out into implementation, put interventions in place that can prevent that. There are some really interesting trials going on at the moment, RCTs that are looking at proactive upskilling of individuals who are in these sorts of at-risk roles. And I think this is something we really need to grow out on. And in particular, when we see, I was going to mention, the government have been very good on this. 2 years ago, released £13 million of scholarships for historically excluded groups from the field, supporting paid master's programs at the conversion level into data roles. And they've announced in the latest second term £23 million to scale up of this sort of intervention. A few observations from our Newcastle programme, we were lucky to get 45 scholarships over 3 years. The financial contribution helps and is an enabler for some participants, but the really significant blocker to people upskilling is confidence, is seeing themselves represented in the field, is giving them confidence to move out of potentially roles that they're in at the moment, and feeling like they can have that permission to take the time for their own development. So on top of these £10,000 scholarships, government, there are a few key things that we do. Pre-sessional training, so we get people in over the summer, learning with us, and the purpose of that is almost less about developing technical skills, but it's more about helping people gain familiarity and confidence in the higher education setting, because it might be their first time through, or they might have been out for some time. And that opportunity to meet members of the teaching team so they can join. We also work closely with industry and have industry mentors, and also an option of pairing people up with mentors from shared protected characteristics. These are people who are in the sort of the chief data officer, senior data science type role, who are able to sort of complement the pastoral support that the university provides as part of its sort of business as usual, with that kind of external support and that upskill. And what we're seeing is a lot of learners going off on industry placement as part of this program, and wherever possible, we offer those as a guaranteed opportunity on the point of entry. So yeah, it's very important if we could say there's an organisation here who are willing to take a bet on, and there's a realistic prospect of employment afterwards, because those organisations very closely to make sure that it's not just getting people in for 6 months and cutting them adrift, but as a long-term sort of recruit. We also have this fact that 80% of 2030's workforce are already in employment. So they've either left university already, or they've maybe gone some other route. So what we really need is access to training with low barrier to entry at the point of need, and with funding models that are supportive of this. So at Newcastle, we've got a pilot project through the government's lifelong learning entitlement, and the idea here is to bring people from healthcare backgrounds, so clinicians, allied health professionals in to for fully funded upskilling as part of that pilot. It's something I think we can really expand on. We've talked a little bit about this need for industry academic collaboration. It's something I'm really passionate about. And if we're going to motivate this for a second, statistics like this, Gartner chirp up and say, okay, 85% of data science projects fail to move from proof of concept into production. And when you dig a little bit deeper there, the primary barrier isn't technical challenges. It's issues around organizational acceptance and things like that. It's culture. So there's a significant challenge here. And this isn't restricted just to smaller organizations with lower levels of data maturity. McKinsey went out to the chief data officers of so-called sophisticated users of AI, and you could probably imagine the sorts of organizations they spoke to there. And they were talking about this translation of academic innovation into industry as being a key barrier to adoption. So these groups need to talk. And in certain areas within the data science bucket of programs, I see particular challenges. And for me, data engineering is one of these areas where, if you look at the top curriculum in the UK, it's lagging way behind industry practice. Last time I looked, I think there's one master's program in Scotland called data engineering, and I might argue it's not my definition of data engineering. But there's a huge gap despite the data engineering sort of persona and role being one that's really insignificant. So here's some work we did with Nesta. It's looking slightly blurry here, at least in the room. The greenish circles are the IT bucket of roles, and right out at the top with a ridiculous median salary, it could even have been sort of median start or median after a year or two. So got data engineering, and that circle is so small that's speaking to the availability of talent who can feed into this. So for data engineering, we're probably talking about pretty smart computer science grads who've also got a breadth of other experience. Whereas for data analyst roles and things like that, you can reasonably pick people from a broad range of feeder programs and prepare them for those roles. Back to that point around learners coming through with this sort of intrinsic excitement around the technology. One thing that we've done through Newcastle and in collaboration with NICD is to take our core data science students out of their company.
You need to explain who NICD is.
National Innovation Centre for Data. So they kind of sit at that translation piece between academic research and out into practice. So they're in a building adjacent to School of Computing at Newcastle that exists as this national asset that we're very, very lucky to have. So in collaboration with Graham on the left and Barry on the right, we deliver out this training where actually, it's largely laptops closed and we're not coding. What we're doing is collaborating with industry partners to identify opportunities for the use of data, maybe risks, working on what does a business model look like around the use of data and emerging technologies. and how to develop out a bit of a strategy around first steps and MVP in that space. And what we hope we do there is equip graduates not with a skill set where they go to their line manager and say, I want to build this model, it's going to be 6 person months of time, it would be cool, but actually be able to articulate the benefits and the risks in terms that industry would recognize. I've picked a few shots that seem to suggest people have great fun while they're with us. What I'd like to talk about next is accreditation and professionalisation. We've talked about a couple of issues, but what's the best way to resolve this? We've seen that we've got degree programs running out of schools of computing, schools of statistics, and all over the place, with data science roles as target occupations for their graduates, with data science in the title, but a need for consistency and a need to advocate for the sort of principles that we've discussed. When you talk to many of the professional bodies, so this is the ones who you would think of first when you think of data science, so Royal Statistical Society, British Computer Society, OR Society, Institute of Maths and its Applications, and others. They'll all tell you that their membership are asking for 2 things. Accreditation for data science programs within their suite, if they're talking about universities, but then also professional recognition from their individual members of those groups. And I suppose always the concern would be that the BCS and the Royal Statistical Society would respond to the demand of their membership independently, develop out their own sets of standards and apply those. And then to that initial challenge, we're back to that starting point where there's uncertainty for employers, because they see a chartered data scientist coming from BCS, a chartered data scientist coming from the RSS or the Royal Academy of Engineering, and it's unclear whether these individuals are comparable. It's unclear whether they're designed to uphold the same professional values as one another. So something that I think probably for me existed as, you know, a pipe dream and something I thought we wouldn't be able to achieve was to bring these bodies together as an alliance. But we've been through that process. All of the bodies there, so we've got Turing Institute, IMA, National Physical Lab, OR Society, Royal Academy of Engineering, RSS. We've worked with our membership, we've consulted and developed professional standards for the chartership of individuals, and we're working on professional standards for programs. And the idea of the alliance is to be as administratively light and operationally light as possible, but exist as a collaboration across these bodies where we have shared standards that are then applied out by each of those bodies. In July, we're at the Royal Society for the graduation of the inaugural cohort. And then from there, the plan is for this logo slide to become much bigger. What we have represented here are probably the professional bodies that represent people as close to that kind of cognate data scientist as possible. But the idea being, we would like every sector to be represented there. So if you're a marine engineer and you have your professional body who exists kind of as your spiritual home, we would like them to be members of the Alliance and adopt these standards in activities. Crucially, everything the Alliance does is open source. So, you know, standards available via GitHub, that sort of thing. Pull requests, welcome. And so nothing's proprietary around it. Came from a call this morning where we're looking at mock-ups of certificates. I'm not sure if the clock or the succulent will actually happen, but I'll leave some space in the bag in July if it does. But there's a nice looping back that we're getting together at the Royal Society for this graduation event in the same rooms where that dynamics of data science skills report that advocated for the need of professionalisation. There's a nice sort of bringing it together over a couple of years. And what I hope this does is elevate the importance, to our colleagues' point around ethics, from being, you know, the nice to have or something that's maybe treated in isolation, as being a critical professional value that as part of accreditation, as part of certification, people are really having to engage with in a very meaningful way. Now, this isn't a Turing sales pitch by any means, but what I will do is highlight just a couple of the interventions that we're working on as an institute. As an institute, what we need to be able to convince ourselves of is that if there's a Turing bingo card, and I can't confirm if there is or not, probably additionality is on there, and the word convening is probably, you know, 2 high ticket items. But it's around not us replicating what's going on elsewhere, not us realizing, oh, there's some really cool training that's happening in universities, let's do it ourselves, but look at the kind of value add activities that we can really take on and distinctly deliver on. The first area, and in recognition of that large slide before, I showed that fragmented landscape of all of the organizations involved in data skills. We have a group called the Data Skills Task Force, and this is bringing together those groups into one place to have some clarity and coordination around the challenges. So we look at data literacy in terms of improvements at the school level. We look at how we can support further and higher education. We look at the support that we can offer to industry. And some of the things that we've worked on most recently in this space are a self-assessment tool for organizations. So one of the challenges that we found, you know, the barriers to entry for executive education for C-suite are prohibitive. Organizations weren't making the best choice in terms of their next steps for activity, and a need to be able to identify their readiness on a few dimensions. So we had use of skills, culture and governance, skills and tools. So this exists as a short form survey that organizations can work through that quizzes them over about 10-15 minutes on those various dimensions. Culminates in case studies, and we signpost people towards case studies from their sector, case studies from organizations who are at a similar level to them in terms of developing out their data competence. And then also a directory of free at the point of access training. And from there, we've built out a short course targeting the C-suite, kind of in that executive education space, to help people make those sorts of informed decisions. So on one side, it's, you know, demystifying some of the terminology, understanding how to specify a job description for the type of role that they're looking for, but then also some deep dives in the type of narrative that I've not seen so much, which are technical reports that go into some depth around the data science techniques themselves, but also have a strong organizational imperative narrative running through them. So in terms of matching up technical development work with the needs of an organization and having that running in tandem. We gave ethics as one example of an area that we could improve, probably in general sector in terms of the way we teach. And I talked about some of those challenges in terms of educators having the confidence, the skills, the knowledge to be able to deliver out on that training. We have a pilot running now called the Data Science and AI Educators Programme. So that's funded through EPSRC in the first instance. And what we're trying to do here is to talk about, well, what is evidence-led pedagogy in terms of teaching data skills? One of the key targets we have here is to embed data skills not within computing programs, but in the breadth of computing programs. We want to target educators who are more comfortable than I would be in terms of leading seminars and those sorts of things, but maybe leading a computer lab session, live coding, doing those sorts of things, represents a little bit of a barrier in an area of learning. When I was teaching fellow 5-6 years ago, early career, just finished my PhD, massive taught load, trying to get the odd paper out here and there. I did a 2-day instructor training course with carpentries, and it was very much along these lines. Okay, here are practical interventions that you can do in a computer-based lab that will be beneficial. The sorts of challenges there were, it was 2 days, went to Leeds, had a great time, learned more in those 2 days than I have through any other sort of teacher training I've done. But it wasn't clear who I turned to if I had questions in terms of how to bring some of those ideas to my practice. And unlike when I was a kid and had, piano lessons on a Friday afternoon, and most of the practice happened on a Thursday night, there wasn't necessarily that accountability. So, you return back into a very busy job where there isn't necessarily the capacity to innovate. So what we're trying to do here is carve out time, having a course that runs over 3 weeks with mentorship to support the uptake and the confidence building in these pieces. And we kind of hope that this is something that we can continue offering out, because we do really see the value in it. So we've got a composition of, I'm going to say, around half academic, around a third industry, and the remainder colleagues who are teaching at the schools level. And the idea being bringing a cohort together of educators from a variety of contexts to share experiences and share learning. And we've got Aisha, Mishka, and
Malvika,
who has led a lot of the Turing Way work that you'll hear about next week, have been doing a sterling job there. Returning to this idea of responsible AI as being this really critical consideration, we recognise there's a threat, isn't there, that universities have to go off and develop curriculum independent, not duplication of effort in terms of developing our curriculum here. So what we're trying to do to support the sector is, slides changed, make funding available, and anyone in the room, anyone on the Teams call, there is absolutely time, deadlines towards the middle of June. We're making almost £300,000 available to teams of educators who are willing to develop out training in the area of responsible AI on the proviso that we'll make that available open source. What we don't want to do is have training material that remains proprietary, remains locked out. We want training that can potentially support self-study for professionals who are already out into practice. We want materials that can be taken up by an educator and run with their class without the need to develop everything from scratch. And we've run several sandpits where we've tried to bring together teams of educators who had otherwise not met, bring together teams of industry and academia to come and sort of tackle problems from dual perspectives. And we've got around £30,000 available per project there, so fairly good chances there. It's Mishka and Sarah who's leading the way there. And then a very fun and supportive place to exist is our data science education interest group, where we welcome anyone with an interest. If you're a school teacher who wants to do more, if you're teaching anywhere in a university where data skills is of interest, we're around 350 strong now, but as a mechanism and a bit of community of practice to share. So I think I'm coming up on time, so I'd be really keen to take any questions from the room. And similarly, I'll scroll down so we can see the meeting chat as well. Any questions? And are there any areas there that you'd like to discuss in a bit further detail?
I'll start.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the things you've got in informatics is a brand new AI program. Should we accredit that as a data science program? Is there a distinction in that?
Yes. So I suppose, but this is a common question I've had. I've had the exact conversation. Oh, you're the Alliance for Data Science Professionals, IMAI. But then the question I ask is, well, okay, what are the professional values that an AI person should uphold that a data science professional shouldn't? And I spent about 10 seconds trying to think of something, and I came up short. But I think the thing to recognise with the Alliance as well, it's not just the technical folk. So we'll have a variety of shapes. We'll have the data scientists, the data engineers, the data analysts, where the majority of their role is technical, applied work. We'll also have people who have been promoted beyond that, and actually they're in management roles, but they have a governance responsibility over the use of these technologies. So we've written standards that, I suppose, respect the disciplinary differences in terms of people who've maybe come from a computing background versus stats versus OR. We've separated out those cross-cutting concerns around responsible practice, ethics, and those sorts of things as professional values, but also in terms of the evidence that you would bring to accreditation. It's either depth of applied work or organizational reach. So you could be a non-technical, or, in your activity, non-technical now manager, and still seek accreditation on that sort of basis. I mean, I'd welcome any views in terms of that professional values piece, whether there are things that need to AI. Kind of by design, it was meant to be as broad as possible, where I would of course say, yeah, consider accreditation. And the way it works is you wouldn't be accredited by the Alliance, you would be accredited by BCS or Royal Statistical Society. So you get the accreditation via the existing route. So we're not muddying the water with another accrediting body, if that makes sense.
I have to hope I don't upset any colleagues in informatics. So the BCS accredit our programs and require all of our students to put in a final year project a chapter on ethics. And what they do is copy 2 paragraphs off the BCS webpage and put them into this chapter. And it doesn't seem to be engaging students yet that this is a much more important task. There's very few even reflected on their own project in the context of that. And maybe examples like Google's thing this week, it's a text to image thing where they've actually decided not to release it because it's too dangerous and it's built in racism and bias. Maybe those will attract the students to think about it. I think it's getting, like earlier, it's getting very compelling examples. What does it mean to the students to think about ethics for change?
And in terms of the way that through the Alliance this would work, it would be a reflective statement on something very specific that they've done. And I suppose what we would want assessors to be looking for is, well, okay, but how did those ethical principles represent a design decision, or how are they reflected in design decisions at the early stage in the project, rather than something that's bolted on, because they should have, and it should have a significant effect.
EPSRC grant writers could do with a similar training as well. Judging from some grants I've reviewed this year, it's like no mention of ethics in the entire. I had one grant that was entirely about building an AI system to detect race, and they hadn't mentioned any possible downsides or considerations at all. Maybe industry is leading.
So a great question from Itoro around details of the funding project. Yeah, we'll absolutely share that afterwards. If you Google something like Turing online learning core, that'll probably get you 90% of the way there, but we'll absolutely share the link with you after. Question from John, who would accredit a program in a geography or built environment department with a strong data science component? Neither the Royal Geographical Society or an acronym I'm unaware of are likely to sign on because it's a tiny minority of graduates. So whichever domain you'd mentioned there, the answer would be hopefully the body who you seek accreditation for right now. Now, Royal Geographic Society have done fantastic work in the data skills space at the schools level, and they're absolutely the type of organisation that we would want to attract to the Alliance in that sort of way. I mean, you make an interesting observation that people are that they might be unlikely to sign on because it's a tiny minority of graduates. I suppose the question would be, does that still hold when we talk about people who have been out in practice for a couple of years? Maybe that represents a greater proportion. But hopefully with the Alliance and not having to develop mechanisms from scratch, develop out standards from scratch, we could find a mechanism to bring them in as light a touch way that they could augment their existing accreditation activities for that. Any other questions from the room or from Teams at all? Yeah.
At the moment, we've been talking about ethics and but I think my question is more along the lines: do we really know what ethics is? For instance, I'm coming from the surgical data science point of view, and medicine has a number of principles: respect for autonomy, beneficency, non-maleficence, and things like that, right? And this today, in terms of AI and technology, are insufficient to capture what we are experiencing at these times. Right? So, in my opinion, things are evolving very rapidly, and we don't really know exactly what needs to be considered. We have some ideas, as it was suggested earlier, but so my question is, where are we there? What needs to be changed? Do we really know what ethics imply? Context. And from the certification point of view, for instance, things are evolving rapidly as well. Like we've got standards that are now talking about software as a medical device.
Yeah.
And this is still on the table.
Absolutely. We're not there yet. Only through deeper collaboration might we come close. And even then, it's going to be an emerging practice. So kind of, and when we talk about the accreditation piece, these aren't standards set in stone that then we'll just ignore. We've worked quite hard to abstract out the principles that will hopefully still hold in, say, a couple of years, 5 years time, but there's going to be a need to refine those. So we're imagining, in terms of the work of the Alliance, standards that are refreshed annually, which is a faster cycle than we see through other degree accreditation processes. So no, you're absolutely right. We're not there yet in terms of that demand.
Cancer is UCL.
Cancer is UCL. Excellent. Brilliant. It's great.
Do you want to say something about the data and truth module? Cancelled it.
Yeah, I can give a very candid story. The module didn't take place in the end. To this point, so it's a fantastic initiative of bringing folks from our humanities faculty into our standard data science programs to deliver what was looking like a really exciting curriculum. The challenge we faced, because it wasn't a major program change, it was a new module that we were sort of introducing slowly, is whenever anything like this is up against, even deeper learning or modules like that, people typically sign up for those in those sorts of numbers. So what we're looking at for next year is much deeper embedding of those principles, sort of in tandem with practical use case, rather than off on its own. A really valuable initiative, but you've got to put your hands up and say, students didn't enroll. Why didn't they enroll? Well, maybe they were looking at job applications or were reading around deep learning and thought that was maybe going to give them a greater competitive advantage in the job market. Maybe they looked and thought, oh God, I'm going to be assessed by essay. That's not why I became a programmer. People maybe saw it as being really interesting, but perhaps a bit of a risk. Lots of challenges there that we're trying to unpick. But
It's going to be taught by a philosopher.
Yeah.
Or computer science philosopher. Interesting.
And where we're looking now is we're very lucky at Newcastle. We've got a new Pro Vice Chancellor for Education who's belief is any degree program without the right level of data skills isn't fit for purpose. Can't help but agree. So now it's looking at how we can do some of this stuff at scale that isn't service teaching. It's not like School of Computing, School of Maths and Stats out teaching service courses 20 times a year across every department. But how do you support self-sustainability out in the different departments? Is there a core set of materials that you can make available and co-teach? Is there support that we can provide to help people who have the disciplinary experience of, I don't know, working in marine engineering, for example, to bring a use case, bring a data set and contextualize some training to be more meaningful for their learners? Looking at ways of scaling that out, building that sort of resilience in the other departments, because otherwise the risk is, the computer scientists and the statisticians go in and teach, but it doesn't inform the research capital in those departments. So then you have people excited by the data modules they do. They then look at final year projects, and there isn't always the level of research support that they need there. And in any case, we have less of an attuned view on the needs of the sector in terms of A1 competencies for data. Time for one or two questions, depending on one. Has any?
I'd be interested from my background where we're trying to get more awareness of data skills, etc. in our institution, in the library here. I mean, you've mentioned in connection with the courses you do at the NICT, was that there's quite a bit of non-technical and all. Is there any support for on a wider basis to kind of get this consciousness of what you can do with data and skills, what it can do for your organization? I mean, we have a few in our senior management who are quite keen on using more data, others are a bit more hesitant. And then there's across all levels, we see this kind of split across people, and a lot of people who still don't really have any idea of what working in an institution like this has to do with this data. And then is there anywhere where, because my line manager, who's our business manager, who's currently the sole person who's really doing most of the business intelligence, with me learning and helping out there, we're kind of keen to push for more of that being accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. And we absolutely saw that gap. And I guess the Data Skills Task Force kind of primer on data skills would probably be a good way to start if we're talking about that leadership audience. There's that, and I'll send a list of links after this session so everyone can see those. In terms of the more practical skill set side, there is the group, the Carpentries, who came very much from a libraries background. The Carpentries began life around data literacy and computational skills for librarians, and it's developed out from there with some really, really high quality training material on the practical side. But I suppose once I've shared a couple of resources, it'd be really interesting to hear from you, well, where do the gaps remain? And then maybe from there, that means the Turing or others should respond through this kind of open call mechanism to say, well, let's stimulate the creation of some material that fits that identified need and is free at the point of access would be my preference for that. That's a really interesting observation. Thank you. Do you want to Nick, would you like to relay Michael's question?
Sure. It's more of a statement than a question, but Mike Duggan says, I think the discussion of ethics as philosophy is not always useful. It's about citizenship, social life, geography, and others. There's baggage applying ethics class as a philosophical appendage for say students who see philosophy as far removed from what they're doing day to day. I guess they did. They voted with their feet. But it's an interesting question, because if you go and talk to Nando de Freitas or Jan LeCun or Ari Marcus, the leading thinkers in AI, they're very engaged in the philosophy of things like what is consciousness and what is reasoning and how do we make these systems do it. So there's two levels of ethics, I think. Where I learned my everyday data ethics was from psychologists doing experimental psychology. They were some of the most rigorous scientists I've ever worked with. And then I had to come back to computing and persuade them to have any kind of ethics approval on experiments, which was interesting. But yeah, I think making it relevant is really your point, and that's a good point.
Absolutely.
I think I answered the question as well.
Yeah, no, very well. Any other questions from anyone? Otherwise, I'm very happy to hang around a bit longer. We can have some one-to-ones, have some coffee, biscuits,
and some fruit. If Rose hasn't drunk all coffee in her big cup. Excellent. Thank you, Matt. That was really good. There's nothing more, but yeah, Matt's very interactive. So email him or harass him in some way somewhere, and he'll sure respond.
Cheers, Nick.
Matt responds faster than anyone else I know.
It's bimodal. It's like within 10 seconds or about a month.
Okay, so thanks, Matt. That was very interesting and thought-provoking. I think good timing for Kings, actually. We've got a lot of thinking to do in this space. Okay, so things I should remind people. If you've not done it, please fill in the attendance form so we know you're here. There's QR codes on the desks, which have been in the chat. There will be a feedback form. Is that reposted in the chat? And we have a mapping survey at King's for people working at King's, looking at your interest in and use of AI, because we're trying to build up this body of evidence for Turing to show where King's has strengths and interests as we look at how we can work with them, I guess, from September this year. Start to figure out what the Turing Network Development Award really means. So with that, thank you, Matt. Well done. Thank you. Thank you, everyone online, for being here. Even people who we met in the cafe upstairs are online. Thanks, everyone. Bye.